So good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome. We've got a packed agenda tonight. We've got two members of the long-range planning team joining us for an overview of a little bit of the interplay between land use and our climate action goals. And we're gonna also take a look at an example of that in the Housing Options Project. And then in the second half of the meeting, led again by Turner, we will be focusing on looking at some operating principles for the group. We're affectionately calling it the CAT Force now, so feel free to use that moniker moving forward. And we'll be diving into all sorts of exciting things like how information will make it to the group and how recommendations will flow forth. But I'm just going to jump right into it because we got a lot on the plate tonight. So first up is the meeting minutes approval from the last meeting. Those minutes were posted to the website, and I would just like to ask if there's any comment or any objection to the meetings as posted. All right, I'm seeing nodding heads. So the minutes stand approved as posted. Next on the agenda is the city update. First thing is keeping up the fight against COVID-19. Let's all do our part to keep hospitalizations down and vaccination rates up as we approach the end of the year. Vaccination is the safest and most effective way to prevent from COVID-19 and put the pandemic behind us. If you need to find mobile clinic information or want to share it with other people, that information can be found on Washington County's website, which is www.co.washington.or.us/vaccine. I can post that in the chat in a moment. We all need to still be wearing masks, avoiding large gatherings, and keep distancing, washing hands, and staying at home if you're feeling sick. City resources are available online at beavertonoregon.gov/coronavirus, which I'll also post in the chat. And the city's current operations will remain in place through the rest of the year with limited access to city buildings, remote work, virtual meetings, events, and other happenings assessed on a case-by-case basis. So we will all be continuing to meet here in this forum, coming to you live from Mission Control. Next up is the Beaverton Arts Mix. Community members can enjoy this virtual art show and art for sale from now until October. So that was till yesterday. So turns out that update is out of date, but hopefully you all got to participate. If not, next year. It's a great program to support local and regional artists during October, which is Arts and Humanities Month. Apologies for not paying attention to the date. And with that, I am going to turn it over, I believe, to Anna Slatinsky. Anna, I will let you introduce yourself and take it from here.
Thank you so much. I'm Anna Slatinsky. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Planning Division Manager in the Community Development Department at the City of Beaverton. I have with me Rob Zoeller, who is an Associate Planner in the Long Range team. And Rob, I want you to go ahead and share the PowerPoint. I'm gonna get us started by talking about Oregon land use generally to help describe what the Planning Division does, and also give some information for the group's kind of context on Oregon land use law, which is actually really relevant to how the city shapes its growth in the future. You can go to the next slide. So first I'll touch on the Planning Division's mission and role within the city. We'll talk about the Oregon statewide planning system, which is pretty unique in the country in the way that planning and development happens in the state is really shaped pretty powerfully by legislation and rules that happen from the state downwards. And we'll talk about a couple of current initiatives that come from the state. One of them is the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities Executive Order that's in the rulemaking process. And then Rob will spend some more time talking in detail about Beaverton Housing Options Project. So go ahead and dive into the next slide, please. So the planning division, as I mentioned, works within the community development department within the city of Beaverton. And the overall department includes almost 100 staff members and bridges things like community development block grants, the building permitting group, site development and engineering, economic development, transportation planning. And the group I lead is the planning division, which includes two teams, the long range planning team, of which Rob is a member, and the current planning team. We work in a pretty collaborative way. And generally we all share the same overall goal, which is, and I'm going to go ahead and read the program goal. It's a little bit long, but bear with me. To protect and enhance the livability and vitality of the city of Beaverton by effectively planning for our community's future by implementing the Beaverton Community Vision, Civic Plan, Housing Action Plan, Climate Action Plan, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Plan, and other policy directives, and administering the comprehensive plan in the Beaverton Development Code, and also to facilitate development in Beaverton that's consistent with community, regional, and state policy by processing land use applications pursuant to state mandated timeframes and providing superior customer service. I realize that's a lot of words, and probably we should work on a more refined way to express that goal. However, I wanted to mention it because it really shows the multiple and overlapping policy areas that we have to be thinking about as we do our work. And on the long range side, we're working to create community plans, such as the Cooper Mountain Community Plan, which is currently underway to plan for development of about 1,200 acres on the western edge of the city. We do research and policy development. We do comprehensive planning. The city has a comprehensive plan, as all cities are required to have in the state of Oregon. And we also work to update the development code. Meanwhile, the current planning team, which actually has a few additional staff members compared to the long range team, primarily focuses on reviewing proposals for development in the city, specifically land use applications. And these are proposals to develop that need to get that land use approval. And they use the development code and the specific requirements of the development code in order to decide whether a particular proposal gets the green light, can go ahead, or will not receive approval. And the current planning team also has a role in updating that Beaverton development code itself. And the policy areas listed in the bar there, I see there's recording in progress. Those policy areas aren't really, they're not exhaustive. There are all kinds of different things that come to play in the work that we do as a team. Although we are often focused on development, namely building stuff, a lot of what land use encompasses is also just what happens in different neighborhoods in the city. And it certainly crosses over in really important ways with how the city uses and plans for transportation, as well as providing all kinds of services. Housing is a huge issue that we talk about a lot, and a lot of the policies are really aimed at understanding whether or not the city can meet the needs of its population when it comes to housing. Equity really permeates everything that we do, considering who is involved in the process of making decisions for the city. How will the decisions that are made affect community members and other stakeholders? These are really important questions. They're difficult questions. And what we find in our work is that they're often you can't have wins across the board. Whatever decisions are made, there are usually some policy aspects that benefit more than others. And one of the challenging things in our jobs is determining how to prioritize different city goals and different community goals in the course of our work. Please go ahead to the next slide, Rob. So I mentioned that Beaverton has a comprehensive plan. I just want to let you know that you can find it on the internet. It has different chapters and goals and policies outlined. The comprehensive plan then also helps shape the development code itself. There's also a link there. We actually have a new online, more user-friendly online tool for presenting the development code. At the end of the day, though, it is a bunch of very technical rules. It's not something that you would read if you're in danger of taking a nap, unless you want to get help going down for that nap. But it is really the rules that apply directly to development in Beaverton. So the comprehensive plan generally doesn't apply directly to those development permits, but the development code absolutely does. The map that you see there with the colors is the Beaverton land use designation map. And you'll see the purple and blue and red colors, those represent the industrial and commercial and mixed use areas in the city, whereas the yellow and brown areas represent residential use. Generally speaking, there are a lot of subtleties within those categories as well. Next slide, please. I'd like to shift gears and talk about that Oregon statewide planning system that I mentioned earlier. It was actually in the 1970s when a number of pieces of legislation were enacted in Oregon, some through the legislative process, some by voters. And there's a lot of detail in the different legislation that was put in place in the 70s, but there are two that I want to highlight today. One of them is Oregon established statewide planning goals that every jurisdiction is required to respond to. And the state also established urban growth boundaries. And these are basically areas where growth needs to be contained within. And it also really distinguishes between what happens in urban areas and what happens in areas that are not urban, namely forest land, riparian areas, and agricultural lands. Next slide, please. So here are those statewide planning goals. The goals that are light blue actually don't apply to Beaverton. By definition, the city is not an agricultural area, which is not to say that there are some remnants and certainly things like community gardens. But namely, as an economic activity, as a land use, cities aren't intended to include agricultural land. Likewise, we're not in the Willamette River, and the coastal areas, et cetera, those other light blue categories don't apply to the city. However, the other goals do apply to the city. And so when we make rules and laws, when we update our comprehensive plan, as the city is making policy and forming its rules for operation, it must comply with those goals. And those goals also direct the city to do some things. For example, we have to create a transportation system plan. The details for that, many of them are related to these statewide planning goals. Next slide, please. Now I want to talk just a little bit about that urban growth boundary that I mentioned earlier. The slide that you see with the yellow on the right, this is a portion of the urban growth boundary that is established for the metro region. Every city in the state is required to have an urban growth boundary, but in the Portland region, metro regional government is actually responsible for maintaining that boundary for the whole metro region. I included a thumbnail of Washington County on the left there because it shows the proportion of the county, which is shown in gray, that is actually within the urban growth boundary. You can see Hillsborough, Beaverton, Tigard. You can see Forest Grove a little bit further to the west. But as you can see, the majority of the county is still outside that urban growth boundary. And that's important because if there's one takeaway that I would hope you take from this presentation tonight, is that the approach that we take to development, to policy priorities within urban growth boundaries is different than the approach we take to those priorities outside urban growth boundaries. By containing growth within urban growth boundaries, the state aims to make development more predictable, to allow for long-term infrastructure planning and investment, building things like water systems, sewer systems, road networks. It takes a tremendous amount of money and time in order to do that well. And there are also some significant environmental benefits to containing growth within a compact area. I'm not going to claim that the Portland region does not have sprawl, because it does. There is less dense development on the outside of the urban region than there is on the inside. However, we have avoided the kind of leapfrog development that sends out those tendrils all over the region that you see in a lot of places in this country. And the reason why is that we have this urban growth boundary. Urban growth boundaries are required by state law to contain a 20-year supply of land for housing and employment. So there is a whole analytical exercise that is undertaken at least every 7 years by Metro, but that includes the other cities in the region in order to decide, should the urban growth boundary be expanded or should it not be expanded? And they use population growth, economic forecast, all kinds of other metrics in order to decide whether there's a need to expand the urban growth boundary. And if it is expanded, then it's expanded in the actually kind of beige areas that you see on the edge, which were identified as urban reserves. So there's I don't want to talk about it too much because it's getting too detailed, but there's basically an analysis that looked at in the next 50 years, where are the areas that could potentially be locations for urban growth boundary expansions. And conversely, they also created rural reserves where they said for 50 years, we will absolutely not expand the urban growth boundary into these specific areas. So there's this tradition in Oregon of really thinking carefully about how and where growth occurs. And it really, in some ways, in a lot of ways, predates the contemporary concerns about climate change, because there are a lot of benefits to dense development besides reducing greenhouse gas emissions. However, one of the benefits of denser mixed-use communities is that people don't have to travel as far to meet their daily needs, and communities that have higher density and multiple uses use less fossil fuels. So we can go ahead and go on to the next slide. Also related to climate change, but not as specifically to the Oregon land use goals, is a group of recent legislation in the state of Oregon, but also some governor's executive orders. Rob, in a few minutes, is going to talk about the Housing Options Project, which will be implementing a piece of state legislation called HB 2001 that requires cities to allow something called middle housing. And then this, which I'd like to talk about for a moment, it's called Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities. It was an executive order from the governor in 2019. The State Department of Land Conservation and Development, don't have to remember that name, but just know it's the state agency that is in charge of implementing the land use laws. They're in the process of making rules to implement the governor's order, which requires, among other things, that jurisdictions must allow taller buildings and denser development in areas which are essentially well served by transit. So there is this recognition as part of multiple efforts to address climate change statewide that being able to develop denser urban areas is one of the things that will allow the state to contain its emissions and meet its climate change reduction goals. Again, among other things in the toolkit. This is a kind of a broad executive order, and so the rulemaking process is a little bit unpredictable. One of the other things that the rulemaking is doing is establishing some requirements for electric vehicle charging, as well as limiting the amount of parking that cities can require. So I just want to touch on that quickly as an example of how the state level land use system and the state level climate planning are working together. And it's something that has to be implemented on the local level. So once the rulemaking for this executive order is finished, there will be some mandates. I'm not sure exactly what form they'll be in yet, but there will be some mandates that cities, including Beaverton, will need to implement through our codes and policies in order to comply with this executive order. And certainly Beaverton's climate action plan already identifies a lot of these things among the different categories of action that are identified in that plan. So with that, I will turn it over to Rob, and we're hoping to leave time for questions at the end. So I'll let him dive into it, but save your questions for later. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Anna. So I'm here to talk about the Housing Options Project. So the goal for this project is to allow a mix of housing types at a range of sizes and price levels in the city's residential areas. This includes accessory dwelling units, duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhomes, and cottage clusters, which are shared homes around a green space. The idea for this project goes back over 10 years to Beaverton's community vision. Over time, other plans and studies have reinforced and added to the themes of the community vision. A few examples include the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Plan from 2015, the Housing 5-Year Action Plan, and more recently, the Climate Action Plan. The project kicked off in 2018, so we are approaching the end of the third phase, which is our draft preferred approach, which I'll describe later. And we're about to enter the fourth phase, which involves drafting updates to the comprehensive plan and development code. We are using a racial equity toolkit to guide the development of equitable housing strategies. I'll talk a little bit about that in the following slides. We're using the GARE toolkit. This is a toolkit specifically designed for local governments. Among other things, this involves studying existing racial inequities, identifying racist actions that helped reinforce present-day segregation patterns, and evaluating whether proposals are likely to produce desired outcomes. For example, let's briefly look at racist actions that helped reinforce present-day segregation patterns. We now know that racist covenants, large minimum lot sizes, large setbacks, design standards, and single-family only residential zones collectively reinforce these present-day segregation patterns. Land use policies, they're not entirely responsible for these patterns. We know that inequities in education and financial wealth contribute to them as well. But we have the opportunity now to create a more equitable housing strategy, and that can start with updating our zoning and development standards. Currently, our residential zoning system still separates residential zones into single family and multifamily. Considering that single detached homes on larger lots are expensive to build and own, this has the effect of separating people by race and income, especially since many communities of color in Beaverton earn lower incomes and are more likely to rent their homes than own. In fact, in areas with mostly single family zoning, the population is 76 to 89% white. Communities of color are least likely to live in these areas, especially the Latinx population, which is 4 times more likely to live in multifamily neighborhoods, which is in the dark gold areas on this map. Using the racial equity toolkit encourages us to think about what steps we can take to promote more mixed income, mixed race communities. To help support this work, state law has also changed in the past couple of years. I mentioned our project kicked off in 2018, but state law changed in 2019. Essentially, duplexes are allowed on all lots where single detached homes are allowed, and other housing types are allowed in all neighborhoods. And that brings me to the draft preferred approach. Before jumping in, I'll briefly review the alternatives from the last phase. In the last phase, we presented 3 alternatives for how to expand housing variety in neighborhoods. Each prioritized a theme: flexibility, open space, and neighborhood design context. Each alternative had different allowed building sizes, open space requirements, and off-street parking capacity. When we reviewed these alternatives with the public, there were some themes that generally crossed most communities. A few of those include that new housing should build community, new rules should allow flexibility, we need more attainable homeownership opportunities, and climate change should transform how we build homes and communities. And that brings us to the themes of the draft preferred approach. To start, we identified the most common themes that we heard from the community and decision makers. That includes flexibility, context, and community. With flexibility, the draft preferred approach promotes housing variety and supports building design that responds to site and climate. With context, it customizes where and how new homes are allowed based on site or neighborhood characteristics in Beaverton. And with community, the approach requires outdoor open space and promotes housing design that helps neighbors get to know each other better. We then created 10 strategies that could help us fulfill the intent behind these 3 themes. Together, these strategies represent an attempt to create a cohesive approach that addresses what we heard from engagement. On the following slides, I'll connect each of these strategies to specific actions in Beaverton's Climate Action Plan. But before I do that, I would like to call your attention to the differences between some of the existing rules and proposed rules. On this slide, I'll review the existing R7 zone. This is a current residential zone which requires a 7,000 square foot minimum lot for single detached homes. On the next slide, I'll review the RMC zone. This is going to replace the R7 zone. Here are 5 things to follow: housing variety, bulk standards, trees, open space, and parking. In terms of housing variety, the R7 zone only allows single detached homes and ADUs. I don't know if I don't think I defined ADUs earlier, but for those who might not be familiar with them, they're small homes on a lot with a single detached home. They're typically limited in size to about 800 square feet now. So in the R7, we only allow single detached homes and ADUs. Aside from setbacks and height limits, there are no additional bulk standards. Theoretically, a home could fill out the entire volume in the box on this empty lot. Regarding trees, on lots less than half an acre with a single detached home, that's most lots in residential zones, any number of trees can be removed without a permit. There are no open space requirements, and the city requires 1 parking space per single detached home, although most property owners choose to add more. And that brings us to the RMC zone. Now, more housing types would be allowed on smaller lots. Each home that is a different color represents a different housing type. With bulk standards, there would be new rules that essentially limit the total amount of building floor area and bulk at the front or rear of the lot. Parking requirements would depend upon lot size, housing type, and neighborhood context. Some housing types do not require parking. Other housing types do require parking, but never more than 1 space per unit, which is the maximum allowed according to state law. The draft preferred approach also introduces tree planting requirements for new housing developments, as well as incentives to save trees. And there are open space requirements that vary by lot size. Now I'd like to shift the focus to the Climate Action Plan, and I'll start with 3 actions in the framework section for buildings, energy, and urban form. And they are to advocate for development of smaller homes, develop strategies to increase housing density, and develop strategies for affordable housing. Of the 10 strategies for this project, 5 directly address these actions. We can start by looking at strategies 1 through 4. The draft preferred approach reduces the residential zones from 6 to 4. This helps expand housing variety in all 3 proposed zones. It lowers proposed minimum lot sizes to make it easier to build smaller homes on smaller lots. And it increases the minimum density so that more homes can be allowed in each neighborhood, which reduces pressure on expanding the urban growth boundary. Another strategy is to reduce the size and scale of new homes and neighborhoods. We propose doing this in 2 ways: by limiting the total amount of building floor area of new homes and applying context angles, which reduce bulk at the front and rear of the lot. These are additional bulk limitations that typically discourage heights above 2 stories, again, at the front or rear of the lots. Our draft preferred approach goes into greater depth. So if you want to know more about bulk strategies, sometimes it takes time to wrap your head around some of these unless you're looking at the diagrams. But the idea is that we generally have lower size limits for single detached homes, but we allow multifamily homes to be slightly bigger so that units are reasonably sized. And now we'll look at consumption and materials management. My background is originally in architecture, and something that I've heard from many green builders is that the greenest building is the one that is already built. So our goal here is to reduce demolitions by promoting more flexibility for internal conversions of existing buildings into multifamily homes. One way to do that is to provide more flexibility with setbacks. The draft preferred approach proposes a 10-foot front setback and a 15-foot rear setback in most residential zones. This has several benefits. It makes it easier to fit homes on the lot. It provides flexibility to support different building orientations that could maximize solar collection, save trees, and support passive cooling opportunities. It also provides more opportunities to support accessible ground floor units that contain a kitchen, living area, bathroom, and bedroom on a single level. And the size limitations discussed previously that prevent homes from maximizing the entire buildable area that would result from these reduced setbacks. That brings us to transportation. The Climate Action Plan mentions two policies in particular that resonate with this project. One that came to mind was to update the city to incorporate electrical vehicle charging infrastructure at multifamily developments, and to also promote and incentivize car share and ride share programs. We're currently meeting with our in-house transportation planners to learn more about what it means for these sites to be ready for electronic vehicles. But something to keep in mind is that if we do have reduced requirements for off-street parking, then we also have fewer curb cuts, and that provides more flexibility long-term to use the street for things like on-street parking, rideshare programs, bike lanes, and transit access. The more we break it up with driveways, it makes it a little bit harder to do that. I would like to talk a little bit about parking, which I actually didn't see in the Climate Action Plan. I don't know if I might have missed that somewhere. But strategy 7 in the Housing Options Project is to establish minimum off-street parking requirements. Single detached homes, duplexes, townhomes, and ADUs would not have minimum required parking. Property owners can still add it if they choose, and it would be easy to fit on most lots. Triplexes and quadplexes would have required parking. Off-street parking requirements could range from 2 spaces per building up to 1 space per unit, depending upon lot size. And we would also allow on-street parking credits to qualify towards off-street parking requirements. And that brings us to natural systems in the Climate Action Plan. 2 strategies in the draft preferred approach address green space in neighborhoods. The first is to ensure outdoor space, and the second focuses on trees. I'll focus on trees since outdoor space will be discussed later. In most zones, for every large tree preserved, development can have up to 600 square feet of additional building space. Also, the draft preferred approach would establish tree planting requirements based on the area available. Currently, we do not have tree planting requirements for new homes in most circumstances. For example, if there were more than 150 square feet of tree area, then 1 or 2 trees might be required depending upon the exact size of the planting area. I'll also add that tree standards are under development, so these might be adjusted as we continue to seek feedback. The last framework category that I'd like to discuss is community well-being. The Climate Action Plan focuses on emergency preparedness and response, food security, and energy efficiency. The strategies in the draft preferred approach, on the other hand, they focus on design elements that bring people together and aim to strengthen community relations. I've spent some time in Japan meeting with urban planners, engineers, and neighborhood groups, both at disaster sites and at the International Research Institute of Disaster Science. And the idea was to learn about how communities rebuild after disasters, a lot of our conversations focus specifically on communities that were trying to come back from being wiped out by tsunamis. But the one thing that kept on coming up in all of these conversations was social capital. The idea that communities with stronger social networks are better able to coordinate recovery, identify shared needs, and rebuild after natural and man-made disasters. We also heard from engagement that new housing should help build community, and that is why outdoor space is an important part of this project. And so for single detached homes and plexes up to 4 units, we've proposed that on lots less than 3,000 square feet, 200 square feet must be set aside for outdoor space. And if it's above 3,000 square feet, the lot size, then 300 square feet of outdoor space would be required. This could be used in different ways for community gardens, a play area with kids and things like that. But the idea is that it should provide a publicly accessible space that helps bring people together and helps strengthen community relations. So I know that's a lot of information, a lot of technical information pretty quickly, but I do want to encourage people to go to our website if you're interested in reading more about this. We do have a survey, and that is a great way to share additional feedback to let us know what you think. But in the meantime, we can also have discussion. We have a few fairly high-level questions that we'd like to present to you. What issues or concerns do you have after hearing about the draft preferred approach? Do you have questions about how it supports the framework categories of the climate action plan? And do you have other suggestions or ideas about the draft preferred approach? Thank you.
Turner, do you want to facilitate Q&A, or is there what do you suggest we do?
Sure, that sounds, I'm happy to do that. And I would start by saying there were a couple of questions that appeared in the chat. I can read them out from James Terwilliger. It was, hi, regards to NPlex buildings, do we anticipate these being managed by a condominium owner association? Because I live in a townhome managed by such HOA, COA, and we are basically not allowed to install solar panels or frankly do much to help reduce our own carbon footprint. Note, I live in Washington currently, but then I'm returning to Beaverton soon, the place of my birth.
I'll add that, well, first, okay, oh, I thought he said Washington County. He's saying Washington State. So it would essentially be up to, a property owner or a developer how it's going to be managed. That's not something that the city regulates. We would be trying to see how we can make it easier for those things. But generally, if there is a requirement in an HOA, that's a private agreement. It's something we don't regulate. If somebody came to us with a project and it were not in agreement with the bylaws or the rules in an HOA, it's not something we look at. Those are private agreements. Yeah. Oh, is that not correct?
Well, it's partially right. So I think there are kind of two questions here. One of them has to do with would there be an HOA and kind of how the property management would work. Mm-hmm. If it's a duplex, triplex, fourplex, those are usually essentially small apartment buildings. They're usually handled on a rental basis, although they can be condos. That's not out of the question. But an HOA, essentially a homeowners association, can also regulate and limit what multiple detached single family homes do. In fact, Beaverton has many existing what we call CCNRs, covenants. Was it covenants restrict? Gosh, I always forget what the acronym. I always forget what the acronym means, but it's basically rules that travel with the deed and the property. And I happen to have one on my house that dates back to 1979. You can barely read the photocopy, but it would prevent me from turning my house into a duplex. The trick is that they're private agreements. they're not regulated or enforced by the city, one of my neighbors would have to sue me pursuant to that agreement in order to prevent me from dividing my house into a duplex, for example. So that's a real risk, and it probably varies neighborhood to neighborhood. However, for new development, the city does have the ability to prevent new covenants and restrictions from doing certain things. For example, HB 2001, which is the piece of legislation at the state, which is helping to shape the Housing Options Project, it actually prohibits in the future CCNRs that would limit middle housing. But for CCNRs that already exist, because they're agreements between private parties, the city doesn't have the ability to abolish them. Now, I am actually unaware whether the state of Oregon allows new CCNRs that do things like prohibit solar panels. I know there are some states that have made such rules, but I do not know whether the state of Oregon is one of them. But it's one of the complexities that we're trying to understand better through the Housing Options Project. But right now it is a limitation.
Thanks, Hannah. I'm going to move. There's one comment I'll read from in the chat, but then folks are starting to raise their hand, which I think is actually a better way to let folks ask their own questions. So Fredy, I see your hand is up, and I'll get to it in just a second. I did want to read the one comment from Reggie, also one of our task force members, who was saying that there are no proposed requirements to keep the trees, I guess, once approval has happened. So the property owner can yank them as soon as the final development inspection staff leaves.
So as Rob said, the rules, including the tree related rules and the parking rules, are still being developed. So we're not done with them yet. But I would also just note, and Reggie, I know that you know the city's tree code really well, that staff is very aware that the rules governing trees in the city are badly in need of an overhaul. They actually go back decades. I think the last time that they were updated was probably the 90s. There have been a few efforts to update them in the intervening decades, but turns out it can be controversial. We actually just completed a tree code audit that Reggie actually contributed to with sharing some of his comments and concerns about our tree code. That was really just to collect information, understand, and kind of diagnose what the issues are with the code in Beaverton with regard to trees, and also take a look at what some other jurisdictions do in terms of their rules around tree planting and tree removal. We do expect that in the future we will have the ability to do an overhaul of the tree code. Right now, it really is a matter of how staff resources are being allocated and the priorities that are set by the council. But we do, based on discussions that we've heard lately, we do expect it to be one of the priorities in the future, but we don't yet have a specific time frame for completing that work.
Great, thanks, Hannah. All right, I have Fredy, looks like you put your hand down. Okay, just checking. Rebecca and then Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, Fred, I think it looks like Freddie's hand is back up. I don't mean to step in front of you.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
It's a quick question. I guess I was curious if someone could go into more detail about the neighborhood characteristics and how they will be taken into consideration when formulating what, I guess, that's it. I'll stop there actually. How will various neighborhood characteristics be taken into consideration?
Sure. We usually, I'll go back to a slide just to talk about it a little bit. Normally I spend about 6 or 7 slides going through this, but I collapsed it into one. But the idea, if you look, one way we do that is with what we're calling context angles. And the idea is, first of all, to look at what neighborhoods typically look like in Beaverton. And some of the older neighborhoods are more likely to have single floor, maybe 1.5 story split level homes. And some of the newer neighborhoods in western parts of the city are 2 to 3 stories. And so to address concerns about like larger homes in these neighborhoods next door, we came up with what we're calling context angles which essentially just kind of push the building mass away from the front and rear property lines. So in older neighborhoods where people are concerned about front and rear, we would apply the context angle in the front and the back. And we've got diagrams that walk through this in the report. I know it's a lot to take in verbally. But then in newer neighborhoods, we already have tall buildings. And so there really isn't the need. We already have buildings that come up pretty close to property lines that are 2 or 3 stories. And so we have the rear context angle, but not the front. So that's one way to look at how building mass would change based on neighborhood characteristic. Another thing would be parking, looking at where some neighborhoods might be able to support on-street parking and then allow those parking credits. But if there are scenarios where they really can't, then maybe we allow a little bit more. So those are 2 examples.
Thanks, Rob.
Sure.
Jennifer.
I can't remember which document it was that I was reading it in, but somewhere it mentioned that the current housing market made it unlikely that any of the R7 or any of the neighborhoods that are predominantly single detached home units would be likely to be converted into middle housing options, and was wondering if that was something that was planning to be addressed on some ways to encourage homeowners to convert their housing.
Well, it's something we've certainly heard, and we I wouldn't say we necessarily know quite how to fix it yet, because I think a lot of cities are looking at this at the same time. We're kind of at the forefront of it and realizing the takeaway is, that changing zoning and making things more flexible isn't always enough. And sometimes this will be expensive, and we might not be likely to see development soon if things don't pencil out. So we do have more work to do to see how we can improve that. We don't have strategies beyond this project yet, but it is something we're thinking about.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Fredy. And then Abdul.
Cool. Thanks, Rob and Anna, for joining us and giving us this rundown. I appreciate it. It's a lot to take in. So I have like a ton of questions. I'm just going to kind of start throwing them out there. So related to kind of this middle housing, townhome, duplex, triplex, ADUs, have we considered kind of like path to ownerships, ways that we can address affordable housing within those requirements? I guess I'm just trying to think of a scenario, like if I'm and I'm going to get this wrong, an R7, homeowner, and I add an ADU, is that going to increase the disparity, in terms of like a socioeconomic perspective from the city of Beaverton? Because now I'm a homeowner and now I have this new ADU in the back of my home that I'm creating income from, right? So there's, we address this issue of those neighborhoods being predominantly white, likely or higher income. So I guess that's one way I'm kind of looking at that. So, is there like in these kind of discussions, is there like a path to ownership for these types of folks that may be moving into these detached ADU, triplexes, duplexes, and middle housing? And then is there anybody looking at kind of like affordable housing requirements in terms of like a percentage or incentives to encourage that type of housing to be built?
So Rob, let me just start real quick by saying that the ownership, the separate ownership of the ADU or of, say, a home that's converted to a duplex cannot be an ownership opportunity. That relies on a couple of legal mechanisms. One of them would be that if the lot can be divided to, instead of having one property with 2 homes, it would be able to be divided into 2 properties. So that is a kind of procedural question, and we are required by state law to do some, make it easier to subdivide property in that way. The other way to do it is through condos. And that also is a legal structure under state law. So both of them require some resources upfront to make that transition. It could be something that happens incrementally, but it is, I think with all of these middle housing options, because there is investment needed to actually do the building, and anybody who's been reading the news these days or trying to get work done in their homes knows that it's getting really expensive to buy building materials, to hire contractors. So this is not something that is going to be accessible for the lowest income Beaverton community members. The part of the philosophy behind it is that by lessening the shortage of housing, that it will allow for the housing supply overall to have less upwards price pressure. In other words, people that have greater financial resources won't be able to outbid people as much because there will be more housing to go around. And also that generally speaking, smaller homes are less expensive, but it is certainly not a panacea when it comes to the problem of finding affordable homes for Beaverton and regional members of the community. So the city actually has a variety of approaches that it's using to encourage the production and preservation of affordable housing. There's a 5-year housing action plan that's not created by the planning group, but it's created by the development division, which is our sister division in the community development department. We have a small team of people who work on affordable housing, and they're really looking at the full spectrum from home ownership support that does some things like helping people with down payments, right up through facilitating the construction of large new low-income apartment buildings. So that's a broad answer, and I'm sorry, I don't know if I've gotten quite to your question, but there's definitely a lot of different things that the city frankly must do if it's to really address the crisis to affordable housing. And I would just say one more thing, which is that the city can't do it alone. One of the things that's been helpful recently is the Metro Affordable Housing Bond, which was passed a couple of years ago. A lot of, literally hundreds of affordable housing units are under construction in Beaverton right now because of that funding source. But the state and the federal government are also sources of money that can help us build and preserve affordable housing.
Great.
Thank you. Can I ask another question?
How about one more, and then, because I know you said you had several, but
Yeah.
we've got a couple other folks waiting to ask questions too.
Of course. Thank you.
Mhm. Okay. I was thinking you would ask one now, but I'll circle back to you. Keep your hand up. I'll come back to you. Abdul.
No, I'd like
Are
to give
you-
others an opportunity to chime in. Sorry.
Great. Super.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I was listening to the plan and I have a couple of questions actually, or maybe concerns that I have with regards to the plan. But maybe it's because the presenters did not go with the details of the plan. So maybe my question, that's why I'm not able to find the answers to some of these concerns that I have. Like, for example, I was thinking with the rapid increase in population, how are agricultural lands being affected by urbanization and increased housing projects? Because I noticed they talked about agricultural land, and we're talking about Beaverton here, that we have a specific land that we know that's what is called Beaverton. And so the agricultural lands, to what extent is that plan considering the possible effects of urbanization and increase in housing projects?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. So the statewide Oregon planning framework has a lot of requirements and a very structured process for enlarging the urban growth boundary. So inside the urban growth boundary, you can do urban development, you can do apartment buildings, you can do subdivisions, you can create areas for industry and jobs. Outside the urban growth boundary, you can't do those things. So the urban growth boundary and agricultural lands versus urban lands are really looked at both on a statewide level, but they're also looked at in terms of the value of those agricultural lands. And the state has a way of assessing very valuable agricultural lands and protecting those. I mentioned earlier urban reserves and rural reserves. Urban reserves are those areas that, well, you know, in the next 50 years, if the urban growth boundary needs to expand, these are the areas where it makes sense to do that. Meanwhile, there may be agricultural areas or forest areas near urban areas that we're going to say, no way, you can't expand there. Those are the rural reserves. I will say, in all honesty, that this is both a technocratic process that involves a lot of analysis, and it is a political process. And both of those things happen together. But the statewide view is really to make sure that the most valuable agricultural and forest land is protected, and also recognizes that urban areas, there's a reason that urban areas grow from inwards out and don't just plunk down in new places. And it's because there's a real advantage to humans and to efficient infrastructure to gathering together. So sometimes there will be a city that grows even though there's a piece of forest or agricultural land that is nearby, because that allows that forest or agricultural land somewhere else in the state to be protected. So there's a lot of weighing that happens there, and frankly, there's a lot of conflict that happens there, where to expand the urban growth boundary, whether to do it in one place versus another. And there's a whole process, including an appeals process, that happens because there are frequently disputes about what the right thing to do is.
Yes.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, to a very large extent, yes. And I have another concern here again. Upon listening to the plan with the second presenter, how does racial equity relate with when it comes to this plan? How does it relate to lenders that almost hold the entire decision to either finance or not finance, coupled with the financial disadvantaged position that minorities encounter? So here we are talking about constructing housing that take into cognizance racial equity. But again, in the aspect of the demand, there must be affordability, and that's just one aspect. We have availability and willingness, but affordability, there will still be issues with regards to these people being able to even access these housing projects, even though with regards to, despite the size that has been reduced to match up with low-income families, that to integrate the population. But so I don't know how the plan actually influence the decisions of lenders.
Yeah.
When it comes to, because when we're talking about these populations, and also now we're saying, okay, we want this minority, to try to get some racial equity within. But we are fully also aware that these minority groups, financially, they are disadvantaged. So most of the activities that will be taking place in those areas will also have some effects to climate change. So because the inevitability of them being financially stranded, you will find out that the vehicles used, the activities that are being done within those areas is still going to be a problem. So to a very large extent, the plan has to look into relating to some financial institutions that will help in this situation, or else we can design the plan, but the activities that will be going on will be a little different.
Sure. So I think that your question are kind of twofold. One of them about access to financing and lending to allow for this kind of investment to occur. And then the second one is just a general question about affordability of housing. Is that correct, Abdul?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So one clarification is that this particular project is really focused on on addressing the development code rules for housing and making sure that we're not prohibiting these kinds of housing to be built, which our current code does. Our current code doesn't allow a lot of these types of housing to be built in many of these areas. So the main deliverable of this project is to update the code. However, the larger conversation around so-called middle housing definitely recognizes that banks and other sources of financing for doing this kind of work really need to be examined through that racial equity lens to make sure that they're willing to lend money in order to do this work. The question of general affordability of these units, I would really just go back to my response to the previous question that Fredy was asking, which is really about, hey, this isn't going to fix the problem, right? If the problem is it's hard for many people in Beaverton to find housing that's reasonably priced for their income, this is really just a little slice of that. This project is just a slice of that. And in order to fully and powerfully address that, the city needs to partner with the county, with Metro, with the state. There needs to be a much larger effort that isn't only about this specific thing. So I'm not trying to make excuses. You know, as Rob described, we have made a serious effort to understand the potential impacts on our low income and BIPOC communities in this work, but we also recognize that this project is only one slice of really what is a much larger effort, and isn't going to be truly really transformative. I think that there's a sometimes there's a fear that that changing the rules will result in a big change in Beaverton neighborhoods, and there are some people that are afraid and unhappy about the changes that might happen. The other side of that coin is that people that hope for changes that are big changes are then disappointed because it's not going to be a really giant change. It's a small change, but one that provides for more flexibility. It allows for these kind of smaller scale changes to happen that we hope will make a difference. But in my opinion, this is not going to be something that actually results in a dramatic difference in Beaverton in terms of housing. It's a good thing to do. It's important that we do it. We're required to do it by state law, but this is only one small piece of what needs to be a larger effort. Rob, would you add anything to that?
No, I think that's very helpful, and yeah, I don't think I could. This is one piece of a very complex puzzle. Yeah.
Thanks, you guys. Maggie, thanks for waiting it out.
Yeah, no, that's all good stuff. I just sort of had one quick concern about the draft preferred approach, which is the tree incentive, like allowing people to expand their property if they're willing to keep a tree. And I think that's something that Reggie mentioned about once they're allowed to, a tree could be removed. And I was just kind of wondering how that incentive would work if we're actually developing the tree code, if we're moving towards like tree preservation requirements or something, then what would happen to that incentive, you know, if we update the tree code? But also I am just a little bit concerned about the incentivization of keeping trees in order to have bigger property space. So
yeah. So we know that the Housing Options Project doesn't have the ability to kind of just take on all of the tree code stuff. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to include basically recognize that the goals that have been set for the Housing Options Project will benefit from thinking about trees, and that it makes sense for there to be some additional regulations about tree preservation and about tree planting with the Housing Options Project, but we don't have the ability to do that full work on the tree code. I don't know what the outcome of that full tree code work will be because we haven't even started the work. But I think that it would include some additional limitations on removing trees from private property. Right now, when we're talking on the scale of a single family home, the vast majority of suburban style detached homes in Beaverton actually don't have any restrictions on removing trees. And I think that that would probably change, but I can't, my crystal ball isn't telling me exactly how that would work. It may be that, you know, the Housing Options Project code will be adopted first, certainly. It may be that we go back and make further changes to those specific provisions along with the overall tree code. I certainly wouldn't rule that out. I think that once we take that really thorough, comprehensive look and start looking at what the different options are for writing those rules, that we're going to want to have everything on the table.
Thank you, Anna. All right, I've got a couple hands left up. If we can be quick, you guys, sort of concise questions, because we should probably wrap up this part of the discussion and give you guys a break. So, oh, Reggie, you went away. I know you did have some interaction earlier. So, and then Fredy, your hand is still up. Did you want to ask one more follow-up question?
Yeah. If Reggie didn't want to ask one, I'd like to ask a follow-up.
He's given a thumbs up.
Okay, cool. So related to solar and renewable and efficiency requirements for these middle housing options, and I'm kind of thinking here in the context of the climate action plan specifically, does the city have any plans to increase the building requirements related to energy efficiency, the inclusion of renewable energy such as solar panels, source materials, or any other items related to that, like tree planting has been brought up. You know, middle housing, as was mentioned, is smaller and therefore more easy to make more efficient. And so I'm wondering if the city has any plans to include or bundle some of those requirements into this middle housing.
So Oregon is actually unique in another way, which is that there is actually a state level building code. Most states don't have their own building code, but Oregon has its own building code. And there are limits as to what Beaverton can do on its own. So I actually don't know whether we even have the ability to establish higher standards for things like maybe say insulation on a city level. Our city building official could answer that question. You know, we're not considering including solar panel requirements and those kinds of things with Housing Options Project, but that would certainly be something that, again, I would want to discuss with the city building official. It's interesting to think about those, and it might, and this group might be the right folks to be asking those questions. I know in my house, I'd love to put on solar panels, but I've got a gigantic oak tree behind my house, and it's not gonna help me much. So again, that's again one of those examples of those trade-offs, right? The oak tree is amazing. It makes my house nice and cool in the summer. I rarely have the need to do other things to cool down my house, but it also means that solar panels aren't going to be something that are going to be worth it for me to install.
So are there other options that the city could look at, just passive housing, or like I said, you know, it just seems, I understand that there's like a energy code requirement. So I think I'd like to see something kind of beyond that.
Yeah. So I guess what I would say is that would be out of scope of the Housing Options Project. Okay. We won't be including any building code changes with the Housing Options Project. But again, that doesn't mean that the city couldn't take a look at another effort to do that. It would be subject to what we're allowed to do under state law. I'm not knowledgeable enough about the building code itself. Since we're a land use shop here in planning, it would be really the building official who would need to answer that question. But I don't see any reason why you wouldn't want to engage with her about that.
Okay, cool, thank you.
So that's a great question in as much as it kind of captures for this group the notion about where you want to look to engage with the city and the different departments and then this, ultimately the city council. That's what your charge is to advise them. But looking at all the different ways in which the city's policies interact with climate impacts, whether it's building codes or land use planning, and figuring out where you want to sort of apply your efforts and your expertise. Reggie, we'll give you the last question here, and then we'll take our break.
Okay, sorry, I wasn't sure if I wanted to ask this earlier because it's not directly related to climate, but I'll go ahead. I'm concerned with the plan about how it could disproportionately benefit for-profit developers, essentially big money. So just wealthy individuals, national and global investors, such as the equity firm Blackstone, coming in, buying up multiple parcels unseen, and then turning them into like rental properties. This would have detrimental effects for our community in the long term, removing ownership opportunities from the public, low-income people, creating like a for-profit operation off of the land. So for example, trees could be viewed as hindrances to profit and then be cut down, as well as the destruction of other natural areas that would require some sort of maintenance, as well as just the increasing influence of global investors, and as far as our land use codes for our local area. So how would the Housing Options Project elevate not-for-profit housing providers while increasing the amount that for-profit housing providers, especially the ones that are the most heavily financed, like how will that increase the amount that they're contributing into the community here, paying their fair share, instead of having a flight of capital?
Well, you're bringing up a lot of really, really big questions there that go a little bit beyond what the land use regulation system can really address. We take land use applications for development from anyone. We don't really distinguish between a homeowner or a developer or a nonprofit. And in fact, the genesis of the middle housing movement, which we started to respond to when this project originated, and then the state responded to, was really trying to basically allow existing residents and homeowners to make changes to their property to better meet their needs. We hear things about people wanting to have homes that better accommodate multi-generational families. A lot of the push to have ADUs is along those lines, and then generally to allow for that historical pattern of pretty segregated land development to be addressed by, again, allowing a wider variety of homes to be created, whether it's through infill or whether it's in our new development areas. Beaverton will never again have a neighborhood where nothing is allowed other than single family detached homes. We'll always in the future allow homes that really can have a much wider variety of characteristics to meet the needs of Beaverton residents. I don't want to downplay the reality that much home development is done by large companies, by real estate investors and developers. They're the organizations that specialize in doing that work. And frankly, we do need them to build homes. We need people whose job it is to build homes to do that. That said, we are concerned about the impact that could be disproportionate to low-income community members and to BIPOC community members. And that's why we've taken a kind of slow and careful approach in the community engagement for this project, to really hear from those community members about what their aspirations are on this subject, and also what their concerns are so that we can respond to it with our proposal.
Great. Well, thank you, Anna, and thank you, Rob. That was just an incredible amount of information, and we'll be digesting that for a while, I suspect. But thank you. Any last words for us before we take our break? And you're welcome to stay on and listen to the discussion that follows, if you're so inclined.
I just really wish you well in these conversations. It's such an important topic, and I appreciate your attention. We covered a lot of very technical information today, so Turner and Kevin, feel free to share my contact information and Rob's contact information with folks here tonight. We'd be happy to address any follow-up questions. Also, the city website is a really great resource. There's a ton of detailed information about the Housing Options Project and about all of the projects that we're working on. So if you want to do a little bit of browsing and reading there, you can probably come up with some more questions.
Great, thank you.
And I'll just encourage people to take the survey, and after you've had more time to look at what we have on the website, it's a great opportunity to let us know what you think.
Excellent. All right, well, thank you again. Really appreciate it. Participation.
Thank you so much, both of you. Look forward to seeing you next time.
Or tomorrow even. All right, well, with that, Kevin, should we take a 5-minute break and then come back and we'll talk about process?
Sure thing. Maybe we can all see how quickly we can take a break so that we don't run over tonight.
Sounds good.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Be right back.
Turner, I have one really quick comment to make when everybody returns
Okay.
before we start.
Okay, sounds good. All right, if folks are back and want to turn their cameras on so we know you're back, then we'll, as soon as we have most of you back, it looks like.
I just wanted to add to one of the answers or reply, one of the questions posed about energy efficiency and how that is being either incorporated to this or other opportunities for incorporating increased energy efficiency into buildings in Beaverton. And we're happy at a future time to have the city building official come and kind of give an overview of what's in their purview and what we can and we can't do. But I wanted to share that the state of Oregon currently has a voluntary reach code. And that's a code that goes above and beyond the base code to increase the energy efficiency of buildings, is voluntary. In the last legislative session, we spent a lot of time supporting a bill that would have the reach code be increased to 90% over the base code, I believe, and then options for local municipalities to adopt it, and then it would be enforceable. That would become basically the base code for municipalities that adopted it. That effort did not move forward, but we are happy to say that it is going to be on our list of priorities for this coming legislative session. So some hope in the future for the reach code to live on. So more updates on that as they come out, but I just wanted to mention that real quick.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Okay, well, so we wanted, as last time, to try to give you guys both a little bit of substance to sink your teeth into, as well as considering some of the process work we need to do at the beginning of this effort, of this task force, to kind of figure out how you're going to work together and what that's going to look like. So, but it seemed like this was a good way to kind of give some reality to some of those questions, because it raises sort of a number of questions about how you want to work together and what that's going to look like. So for example, we got a couple suggestions, or several, Kevin did, on sort of topics for the group to take up. And this one was one that was suggested, but it was also one that was already on Kevin's radar, and he'd been talking with the planning division folks and thinking it was ripe. The timing is really good because of where it is in the process, for you all to engage with it and look at it from the climate action perspective in particular, as this group is. So that worked out well, but it also begs questions. So how is, one of the first questions I think you all have to deal with is sort of how you're going to decide what you work on. There's so much happening at the city of Beaverton that has implications for climate action, that's relevant to the climate action plan, that you may want to offer your perspective on, or that the city may actively seek out your input on. And then, so that leads to a subsequent question which is, so once you decide what you want to work on, how are you going to do that? For example, today we had some members of city department or city division come and talk to you about the work they're doing, talk about how they see it relates to the climate action plan, and how they're working synergistically with that plan, and getting kind of your feedback, and which does two things really. It helps you all as a group learn and individually learn what the city is doing and how all the different pieces of the puzzle that they're working on that are trying to implement the climate action plan or that are affecting it in some way or another. And it also provides an opportunity for, obviously the plan division has done a lot of, and Rob has done a lot of public engagement along the way there, but this is an opportunity to talk with a group who's particularly focused and has some expertise and interest in this particular aspect of the work he was doing, the climate work that you are doing. So it's an opportunity for the city staff to get that kind of input and creative thinking from all of you. So it's sort of a win-win type of engagement. And so they walk away with having gained some from the conversation, but then there's an opportunity for you all potentially to think more deeply and offer more thought or input on it after the fact. I mean, this was kind of, you got a lot of information really fast. You got a lot of, you got some questions answered, but as a group, you might want more time to kind of talk about it amongst yourselves or think about additional things that you'd want to convey based on that, based on what you heard. So figuring out what to do with the information that you get from the city or from a presentation or something like that, and how to convey it. Your charge is to communicate with the city council primarily, and share sort of kind of big picture policy level stuff. So how do you sort of process what you hear, the information you gather from city departments or elsewhere, and turn that into something that you can share with the city council. So it's kind of, how do you decide what you do? How do you learn about and process that work? And then how do you convey your message to the council, which is, your primary point of contact with the city. So we're obviously not going to answer all that in one evening, but it would help probably to begin to work on a set of principles. So other boards and commissions, which technically you are not a board or a commission, which might be a good thing. Boards or commissions develop sets of bylaws that are often determined a lot by the resolutions or the ordinances that created them, the legislation that created them. But you have a little more freedom than that. So you have an opportunity to write kind of your own, to a certain extent, your own kind of operating principles for how you're going to work together. And we've got a draft of something started that we can share with you and begin to get some of your input on and help you guys reach agreement on how you're going to work together. So let's see. My dog is suddenly taking great interest in me for some reason. Must be dinner time. Let me, Kevin, okay if I share my screen? I think okay. Make sure I find the right one here. Is this it? Wait. Okay. All right. Can that be seen, Kevin?
I think it's loading, maybe. I just see black.
Yeah, same.
Really? It says I'm sharing my screen, but okay. Well, that's not good.
I can try sharing. Are you trying to share what you had sent me earlier?
Yes, actually. So.
All right. Let me.
Okay, I will stop
sharing it. And
apologies for that. It looked like I was sharing.
How's that look?
Good, but small. Can you make it a little bigger and scroll up to the top? There we go.
That good?
Mhm.
All right.
So I'm just going to take a few minutes. We have about 15 minutes. I'll just introduce this and see if folks have questions or comments as we go through it. The first part of this covers just kind of the basics of who you are and where you came from and what you're here to do, most of which was sort of articulated already in the resolution that created the task force, mostly, and then the appointment process itself. And then towards the end, there's some more open-ended pieces of it that I haven't offered any definitive text for, because it's really something that you all will need to discuss amongst yourselves about how you're going to work together. So obviously, just to quickly go through it, the name of the group is the Climate Action Task Force, and it was created by the City of Beaverton Resolution number 4712. The purpose sort of generally stated, and this is something that, we could talk about, it doesn't come straight from the resolution, but rather interpreted from it. And it is that the purpose of the task force is to help the city communicate its climate message to the community. So that's the communication one direction, and to ensure the perspectives of community members are offered, heard, and considered by city leadership as decisions are made around city-sponsored climate action activities and programs, and the city's ongoing commitment to the Beaverton Climate Action Plan, adopted in 2019. So it's all about two-way communication between the community and the city, specifically the city council. And then the specific duties are set forth below. So this is, sorry, I'm trying to scroll it myself and I can't. Can you scroll down a little bit? So those are the duties. We've been over them before, that are the way this is outlined in the resolution that created the task force: to enhance city council awareness, to assist the city council and the city in devising strategies to include climate action considerations whenever they're deliberating on decisions that may be impacted by climate change. So kind of a little bit like what you did today, right there. Provide feedback on the potential impact of proposed climate action related policies, programs, and activities on specific communities and the community at large, which will be informed by listening to members of the community about issues involving climate action. So you did some of that today too. Serve as a resource for the city's public engagement campaigns. That we haven't done yet, but the task force shall report at least annually to the mayor. We'll worry about that a little bit later. Prior to the end of the climate action plan, you may make recommendations about the structure and scope of community engagement when the BCAP is expected to be updated in 2024. And can you scroll down a little bit more, please? And then you can recommend to the city council changes or additions to the climate action plan. So that's the basic scope of your work as outlined in the resolution. The racial equity lens piece, I think, is something that appears, that's language that came from the city of Beaverton. And I believe it's language is included in a lot of your boards and commissions work. And then, so this is, again, just kind of summary of where things are at. So consistent with the resolution, you're composed of 13 members, which were appointed by the mayor, confirmed by the city council, and there were also 3 alternate members that were appointed and confirmed by the city council. In general, this was kind of the expertise and characteristics they look for in appointing all of you, so that you have experience in community engagement, conservation, transportation, not all of these, every one of you, obviously. That would be amazing if even some of you had experience in all this. Transportation, construction, solid waste, energy, climate justice, business outreach, policy development, housing, or climate science. And you're all supposed to live in Beaverton. We won't be checking addresses. I won't be. Meetings, you're holding regular monthly meetings. And then there's this section holds out the possibility that with the collaboration and agreement of the staff, you could hold special meetings or convene subcommittees as needed down the road. It's expected that all members will attend meetings, and some of the other entities like this in the city have very strict rules about how many meetings you have to attend to. This language that's proposed here is not super strict, but just says if you're not going to make it, please let us know. And then the task force as a whole, if somebody's really shirking their duties and not showing up more than half the time, that the task force could collectively ask for a replacement in that case. So that's just kind of a, to help remind people that they're supposed to, you've made a commitment to do this work, and I'm not expecting that to ever be an issue with all of you. Vacancies just allows for, if there is a vacancy, if someone has to leave the task force, that the task force can request that the mayor appoint a new member to be selected from the alternate members, ideally, if there's alternates still available. And then the term, as stated in the resolution, is that the task force shall be in existence for the duration of the Beaverton Climate Action Plan, which runs currently through 2024, right, Kevin? Yeah, okay. But then there's the expectation I've seen in several places is that it will be updated, not just end then. So a little unclear as to what actually happens to the task force then. So, but that's something that we don't have any control over necessarily. But task force staffing. So Kevin is your staff liaison, and he's providing assistance, including but not limited to arranging the meeting space and time, notifying the group members in public meetings, distributing agendas, all these things, providing information about relevant policies. He's your source to answer questions and get info from other parts of the city, and other external resources also available. Help indoctrinate new members and get money for you guys to do your work or to support these meetings and such like that. But he's not a member of the task force, technically. And then this meeting support and recording, the staff liaison along with the city of Beaverton is providing the virtual meeting platforms, kind of just nuts and bolts. So that, and before we go further down there, does anybody have questions or comments or thoughts about all that? A lot of that stuff is just kind of articulating where you're at right now. But it's good to have that kind of setting, that sort of document there, so everyone knows what to expect, as you go down the road and get further into this. Questions or comments on any of that? Okay, it's not, super controversial. How are we doing? Okay, so I'm going to introduce a few questions for you all to consider and chew on, and then probably we'll mostly have discussion about it at our next meeting, since we're running a little low on time. And do we have any members of the public, Kevin? Just so are we going to need public?
Sorry, I'm in a different view because I'm sharing.
Oh, sorry. I see 0 attendees other than panelists.
It does not look like we currently have any members of the public.
Okay. Was Mr. Terwilliger a member of the public?
Yes.
Okay. There was an answer to one of his questions that was provided by Fredy, so we might want to pass that on to him at some point or not. In the chat, sorry. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, stop me if we need to stop for any public comment, but otherwise I'll ramble on a little bit longer than I might otherwise have. Can you scroll down a little bit more now? We'll go to the next session about task force leadership. So there's no requirement, as there often is for commissions and boards, to elect a chair, a single chair, and a single maybe vice chair, and a single secretary to chair and run the meetings and that sort of thing. Nevertheless, it's helpful to have a group of folks in an entity like this that will be leaders in the sense of helping the group do its work. And it does require often a little bit more of a time commitment and such. And it doesn't have to be as hierarchical necessarily as a chair and a vice chair and a secretary. And a lot of your quote unquote secretary roles are already being covered by the city who records the meetings and produces what are the official minutes that you have to do under public meeting law. So you have an opportunity to have a more a different type of leadership structure. And one way you might think about doing that, and this is something to consider, and then we can discuss at the next meeting, is to have a group of co-chairs or a couple of co-chairs or a small committee that is like a steering committee or a leadership group that can work with, and the role of that, well, among other things, is the roles can be whatever you decide it to be, but often what is helpful to have a group like that to do is to work on behalf of the task force, to work with the staff liaison in particular, me for the time being as well, but and other city staff as appropriate, to develop meeting agendas, to begin to help set the agenda for the group. And then to work with all those same folks along with the task force as a whole to also plan kind of longer term what the group is going to work on, and bring that back and just do, some sort of committee work to help guide your discussion about what you're going to work on. And then, the role of that group, those co-chairs or whatever you decide to call them, would typically be to chair and convene and run the meetings. That allows Kevin to sort of step back and not necessarily be trying to direct the work of the committee or the task force, but rather to be a resource as is sort of envisioned by his role as a liaison to staff, and be able to help you understand this, where the city of Beaverton's doing and coming from, rather than having to worry about running the meetings. So can you scroll down a little bit? And then there was just some details. So these were some things that came out of some of the bylaws stuff I sort of grabbed to make sure that that if you were wanting the staff to do additional meetings with the group, that you work with them to make that happen, not just call them independently, because there's a public meetings law aspect to the work you do. So you can't just go rogue and not have the meetings be publicly noticed and all that sort of thing. So for example, I work with a commission that was created by statute to work on the Willamette Falls locks, and they decided that they needed to create a chair role, but also decided that there were several individuals that were really interested in helping lead that group and do a lot of the heavy lifting. So they formed a chair and co-vice chairs kind of group. We were required to have a chair by the statute, but we added co-chairs, and we created an executive committee, and we created a lot of structure to help the bigger group do its work more efficiently and effectively. So you might think about what that looks like for all of you, and if there are some of you that are interested in leaning in and helping plan meetings and plan the long-term work, and then work with both staff and with the task force as a whole to kind of move the ball forward. Any kind of questions about that, or thoughts or comments? Okay. It must be terribly persuasive, or you all are terribly hungry. All right. So the one other kind of piece of this that I'll call out for you to think about between now and the next meeting is the decision-making model. So there are a couple different ways you could approach this, and I'm actually not, I don't have strong opinions yet about which that should be. The classic model for a board or commission serving a city is the voting model. You have a certain number of folks that have to be at the meeting for there to be quorum, and then you vote in majority, the majority rule. That's what you do when it comes time for decision making on, what you're going to communicate, or what your recommendation on something is going to be, or how you're going to communicate with city council, or whatever that decision looks like. And with a super diverse group of citizens, of stakeholders from around Beaverton, that may be the most efficient and effective model going forward. Another model to consider is a consensus model. So in that case, you'd probably have to take some more time as a task force to work on reaching a recommendation or decision, or whatever it is that you're trying to get to, in a form that everyone on the task force can live with. So that's how we just often define consensus. It's a result that everyone involved can live with. It may not be their favorite thing, or it may be their favorite thing, but it's all something they can live with based on all the input and interests that have been shared around the table. So that's an opportunity to really work. It takes a lot more work than voting, but it can achieve, more powerful results, more durable results sometimes. And so you may want to think about whether that is a component of us striving to reach consensus as a group is important to you. You may want to consider embodying that in your decision-making process somehow. And it's not, I don't know that you couldn't develop some sort of hybrid, but and there's also an opportunity in the consensus model. So if you can't reach consensus, because it is a big group and there's a lot of different ideas about things, and if you can't reach consensus, you could still have the opportunity for task force members to articulate areas of agreement and areas of disagreement and why they don't disagree. And that can be a really informative kind of bit of information to share with the city council as being your primary target, because it really helps them understand kind of the challenges around a particular issue. So there is some opportunity there to provide more clarity, if not a perfect decision. It's not like a voted decision where this is what you said and there's no nuance to it. So that's something we can dig into a little bit more next time, about kind of how you want to look at that, or we may try to get some input from you between meetings on that. And then finally, the final piece that's in here that's really not well articulated at this point is what sort of process are you going to use to select the issues, and how, it's the what and how are you going to actually do you have a process for doing it? Do you get a presentation? Do you sit on it for a month and then you discuss it more in depth at the next month's meeting and then make your decision, whatever that is, on it? I mean, maybe that's a model using whatever decision-making process that you've decided on. but it will be worth articulating that in here so everybody kind of knows what to expect about what you're going to do with an issue when somebody brings, when the city department or the city council asks a question of you. All right, I saw a hand go up a second ago. Did anyone, any questions or
Yeah,
thoughts about that?
that was me. Sorry.
Okay.
I just had a thought that given the roles of the task force that we went over earlier, a couple scrolled up pages, was primarily around communication, right? In both directions. That I guess I was wondering if I was missing something. It seems like the consensus model really is much more designed around communication insofar as it communicates multiple opinions if multiple opinions are where we end up with, as opposed to a voting model where only one summative opinion is communicated. Am I missing something there?
No, not in my thought. You're not missing anything. The advantage of a voting model is it can be incredibly efficient, and you don't spend a lot of time going back and forth. And but again, if in a consensus model, if you understand the occasional benefit of agreeing to disagree on pieces of an issue and then articulating that and why, then you're right. It communicates more than just the vote would in the same circumstance. Syed.
Yeah, to Rebecca's point, I would assume we need to reach some consensus just to make sure we all agree to this. I don't know if this would be a piece that we could draw some kind of voting ideally on, but yeah, I do agree that it flows from the top down, that given the diversity of the task force, it is so that everyone's opinions or whatever they're representing is accounted for. So obviously leaning towards, but I know you also called out the hybrid model where you aim for consensus, you give it the time and the due diligence that's needed, and then if you have to go to option B, then you press that lever. I think I had a question about, like, I don't know if you'll get the opportunity for you to sort of share this, provide some feedback, like what's the best way to kind of work on this to be able to gather the appropriate feedback and have an avenue for discussion and conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've had some conversations with Kevin and with Scott about it a little bit, and I think we could probably come up with a suggestion, but I would encourage you all to also think about, if there's a way that you would like to go about doing your work, what that looks like. Abdul.
Yes, I'm also equally concerned about the consensus model, because at the end of the day, I only hope that this model will not only try to get a winner, but rather try to bring out the most prevalent suggestions or decisions that are workable and the most appropriate, rather than just maybe, I don't know how the model actually is designed right now. So, but I'm just really concerned that the model should be able to bring out relevant and workable decisions rather than just quantifying numbers as to which one is most prevalent and which one is not.
Right, I think that is an advantage of working in at least a striving for consensus kind of model, is that you get a lot more information about what's workable and what isn't. I mean, you can always articulate a lot, even if you're voting on it in the end, but you can do a lot of describing about what it is you're voting on. But the consensus model does make you do a little more work to try to find solutions that work for everybody, or that everybody thinks works well.
Okay.
Reggie?
Oh yeah, I totally agree with Abdul. I think we really want to make sure that we have like a, laser focused messaging to city council and the mayor so that, if we provide too broad of recommendations and it's so long, then there's the likelihood that things will get glossed over, things will get cherry picked for whatever's like most convenient instead of what's most necessary. So I think like what we should communicate are definitely points that we all can agree on, through that consensus.
Great. Yeah. Any other questions at this point? Kind of getting low on time, but we don't have any public comments, so I think we're all right. Rebecca.
So I do have one other question that I've been waiting to ask. So you mentioned how we decide which topics to focus on and how to design our topic or our areas of focus. And I guess I was wondering, how are we how are we able to even learn about what areas of focus the city council is taking up this year? Are we going to get an opportunity to have more issues presented to us, like the Housing Options Project was presented to us, so that we can evaluate where we'd like to devote our time? Or is it on us to kind of do that research for ourselves and then have that discussion amongst our group?
Great question. I think I'll let Kevin maybe answer that one.
Yeah, I would say it is up to the group to decide what the areas of focus would be, but for a realism, right? We want to be focusing on things that we can actually be affecting some change on. I think the climate action plan and what it is already laid out and what council has already seen is a good starting point for those things. But yeah, we can provide more programming on what opportunities we see that there are, if that would be helpful for the group to go over them, and what the priorities for council are when they become more refined.
I think that would be a great topic to continue into the agenda for the next meeting, if that's possible. I attend these state EJ task force meetings, and on a state level, agencies bring issues to the task force to have the Environmental Justice Task Force comment and give appropriate context from their perspective. From every state agency is required to do that. And not that I'm suggesting that every city agency needs to bring every action that they're considering to this task force, but if we can, if we can continue this conversation in a later date such that we can investigate ways that city council can bring additional issues to us for climate related context, that might make our discussions along these lines a little easier. I don't want to take us past 8 o'clock, but if we can push that, that'd be great. Thanks, Kevin.
That's great. Great feedback. All right.
So yeah, in closing, I mean, I think that's an excellent point, Rebecca. And one of the things that I wanted to kind of touch on or hope that would come out of tonight is that the primary role of the Climate Action Task Force is to advise council, right? It's great when projects can come and you have an opportunity to provide them feedback, and that's like a way to strengthen projects. But that the projects visiting is really a way for you to gather information and come up with broader knowledge on all of the interplay of different projects like we saw tonight and how complicated they are, and then use that information to, through the methods that Turner described, to provide policy recommendations for council, which is their focus, and not necessarily the nitty-gritty little details of the parking space needs to be 6 feet wide instead of 12 feet wide or something along those lines. So next time, I know we're running over, so I don't want to take up anyone's more time, but we can kind of talk more about the pathways for, it sounds like both how information gets to you all and then where we're going to have it flow from there. Any closing comments, Turner?
No, that would have been exactly what I would have said. So that's great. I was just checking the chat to see if there was a question there. No.
All right, well, thank you all very much. There was a lot of content, a lot of information for tonight. I will send out some notes and answers to some different things that we talked about. And feel free to reach out with any information. I know it takes some time to process what you hear and whatnot. So send me an email, give me a call, whatever. And we will see you all next time.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Good to see you.
Thanks all.